The church was full. White flowers lined every row. Soft music played as guests waited for the bride to walk down the aisle. Claire stood at the entrance, holding her father's old watch in her hand. He was gone now, but she wore his watch pinned inside her dress, close to her heart. She took a deep breath and smiled at her reflection in the small mirror someone held up for her. Today was her wedding day. Today, she would marry Mark. Mark was not rich. He was not from a powerful family. He worked hard, he was kind, and he loved her with his whole heart. That was enough for Claire. It was not enough for her family. Her mother, Linda, sat in the front row. Her sister, Diane, sat beside her, arms crossed, lips tight. Their grandmother, sharp-eyed and proud, sat on the other side, watching everything like a judge in a courtroom. The music changed. It was time. Claire stepped into the aisle. Every face turned to look at her. She smiled through her nerves, searching the crowd for one face. Her mother's Linda was not smiling. Claire kept walking, one slow step after another. Halfway down the aisle, something happened that she would never forget. Her mother stood up. The music stopped playing in Claire's ears, even though it kept going in the room. Linda's voice was shaking, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Stop," Linda said. "I can't let this happen." Gasps spread through the church like a wave. Claire froze in the middle of the aisle, her bouquet trembling in her hands. "Mom." Claire whispered, "What are you doing?" Diane stood up next, her voice sharp and cold. "This marriage is a mistake, Claire. You are throwing away everything for a man with nothing. Dad would be ashamed. Don't you dare say that," Claire said, her voice breaking. "Don't you dare use Dad's name." But Diane wasn't finished. She turned to the guests, her voice rising like she was performing for them. "She is choosing a stranger over her own family. If she marries him today, she is no longer one of us." The words hit Claire like a slap. She turned to her mother, silently begging her to say something, anything, to stop this madness. Linda opened her mouth. For 1 second, Claire thought she saw doubt in her mother's eyes. But then Linda looked at Diane, then at the grandmother's stern face, and looked away. "I'm sorry, Claire," Linda said quietly. "I can't support this." Then, one by one, her family stood and walked out of the church. Neighbors, aunts, uncles, even childhood friends who had come because of the family name. Not because of Claire. Claire stood alone in the aisle, still in her white dress, her bouquet now hanging limp at her side. Whispers filled the church. Some guests looked away in pity. Others looked excited, like they were watching a scene from a movie. Mark walked toward her. He didn't care about the whispers or the empty seats where her family used to sit. He took her trembling hands in his. "I'm still here," he said softly. "Whatever happens, I'm still here." Claire looked at him, tears sliding down her cheeks, ruining the makeup she had spent hours perfecting that morning. But somehow his words gave her strength. "Then let's finish this," she whispered. They turned to the priest, who looked shaken but nodded. The wedding continued, but it was different now. Quieter, smaller. Just a handful of true friends remained in the church, watching two people promise their lives to each other in front of empty chairs, not as they said their vows. Claire's eyes drifted one last time to the church doors. She caught a glimpse of her mother standing just outside, half hidden behind a pillar. Linda was watching. And for one brief moment, before she disappeared completely, Claire saw something on her mother's face that confused her. It wasn't anger. It was fear. Why would her mother be afraid? Afraid of what? Of Diane? Of the grandmother? Of something else entirely? Claire didn't have time to think about it. The priest was speaking. Mark was smiling at her, waiting. She pushed the question away and focused on the man in front of her, the one person who hadn't abandoned her. They said "I do." They kissed. A handful of friends clapped quietly in a church filled for hundreds. That was the last time Claire saw her family for 11 years. She built a new life with Mark. Far from her hometown, far from the family name that once opened every door for her. It wasn't easy. There were nights they couldn't pay rent. There were days Claire cried in the bathroom so Mark wouldn't see. But she never once regretted her choice. 11 years passed. Claire changed. She grew stronger, sharper, wiser. She built a career from nothing. She became someone her family would never recognize, not the frightened bride who once stood alone in a church, but a confident woman who controlled boardrooms instead of being controlled by them. She had almost stopped thinking about that day. Almost. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Claire's phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something told her to answer it anyway. Hello. There was silence for a moment. Then a voice, older and shakier than she remembered, but still unmistakable. Claire ... It's Mom. I need your help, please. Claire's hand tightened around the phone. 11 years of silence, and now this. After everything, after the humiliation, after being erased from her own family, her mother needed her. Claire closed her eyes and asked the only question that mattered. Why now? Her mother's voice trembled on the other end of the line. Because ... If I don't tell you the truth now, it might be too late. For both of us. Claire didn't answer right away. She stood in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, staring at nothing. The question hung in the air between her and her mother. Too late for what? Claire finally asked, not on the phone. Linda said, "Please, Claire, just let me explain in person. I know I don't deserve it, but please." Claire closed her eyes. 11 years of silence rushed back to her all at once. Before she could think of an answer, her mind pulled her back to the weeks right after the wedding, back to the beginning of it all. 2 days after the wedding. Claire and Mark were still unpacking boxes in their small rented apartment when Claire's phone buzzed with a message from an old school friend. Everyone's talking about what happened. Are you okay? Claire frowned and opened her social media. She found post after post and message after message. The story had already spread through their hometown. Like fire through dry grass. Claire abandoned her family for a poor man. She broke her mother's heart on her own wedding day. She never even said thank you for everything her family gave her. None of it was true. But no one who mattered seemed to want the truth. Claire scrolled through the comments, her stomach twisting. She saw people she had known her whole life, teachers, neighbors, old friends, repeating the same story, word for word, as if they had all read it from the same script they had. Diane had written it. Claire didn't need proof. She knew her sister's voice, even in someone else's words. Diane had always known how to control a room, how to turn a story so that she was never the villain. Mark found Claire sitting on the floor of their half-unpacked apartment, phone in her lap, tears silently falling. Don't read it, he said gently, kneeling beside her. None of those people know what really happened. That's the problem, Claire whispered. They don't need to know. They just need a story to believe. The weeks that followed were hard. Claire had grown up with money, with drivers and housekeepers and vacations twice a year. She had never had to worry about rent or groceries. Now, every small expense felt like a mountain. Mark worked long hours at a small auto repair shop. Claire took a job at a local bakery, waking up before sunrise to knead dough and serve customers who had no idea she once wore designer dresses to charity galas. It was humbling. It was exhausting. But there was something else underneath the exhaustion, a strange, quiet pride. For the first time in her life, everything Claire had, she had earned herself. Still, some nights, she cried into her pillow, missing her mother. She wrote Linda a letter one evening, her hands shaking as she chose every word carefully. She didn't want to argue. She didn't want to blame. She just wanted her mother to know she was alive, that she was trying, and that despite everything, she still loved her. She mailed it to their family home, hoping. What Claire didn't know was that the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Diane was the one who collected the mail. Diane recognized the handwriting immediately. She stood by the mailbox for a long moment, staring at her sister's careful letters spelling out their mother's name. She should have given it to Linda, she knew that. But Diane had learned long ago that family loyalty meant nothing compared to family money. And Claire's return, even just her voice, even just a letter, was was a threat to everything Diane had worked to secure. Diane carried the letter inside, sat at the kitchen table, and read every word twice. Claire's letter spoke of forgiveness, of hope, of missing the woman who raised her. Diane's jaw tightened. She struck a match. The letter curled and blackened in the kitchen sink, turning Claire's careful words into ash and smoke. Diane washed the ashes down the drain and never mentioned it to anyone. Linda never knew her daughter had reached out. She spent the year believing Claire wanted nothing to do with them, because that was the story Diane made sure she believed that later that same week. Linda sat in the family's grand living room, staring at old photographs of Claire as a child. Her fingers traced the edge of a photo from Claire's 10th birthday, when her husband was still alive and their family still felt whole. "Do you ever think we were too hard on her?" Linda asked quietly. Diane looked up from her paperwork, her expression unreadable. "Mom, she chose this. She chose him over us. We didn't do anything wrong, but she hasn't called, hasn't written." Not once. Linda's voice cracked. "Doesn't that seem strange to you?" Claire was never the type to hold a grudge. Diane's hands stilled for just a second before she continued writing. "People change, Mom, especially when new husbands convince them to." Linda wanted to believe her. It was easier to believe her. Believing Diane meant she didn't have to face the guilt of that day in the church. The image of Claire's face when her own mother stood up and turned away from her. "It's better this way," Diane said, setting down her pen and meeting her mother's eyes. "Claire is gone. Let's keep it that way." Linda didn't answer. She simply nodded, the way she always did when Diane spoke with such certainty. But that night, alone in her room, Linda took out an old photo of baby Claire wrapped in a yellow blanket, and she cried until she had no tears left. She didn't know that hundreds of miles away, her daughter had cried the exact same tears, wondering why her letter was never answered. Back in the present, Claire opened her eyes, pulled from the memory by her mother's voice still waiting on the phone. "Claire, are you still there?" Claire took a slow breath. 11 years of silence, a letter that was never answered, a family that chose lies over truth. All of it lived inside her chest like a wound that had never fully closed. "I'm still here," Claire said finally, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Where do you want to meet?" There was a pause, and then Linda gave her an address, not their old family home, but a small cafe near the edge of town, neutral ground. "Tomorrow," Linda said. "Please, Claire. Just give me 1 hour." Claire looked at the wedding photo on her shelf, the only photo from that day, showing her and Mark standing in a church half empty, surrounded by nothing but love that had chosen to stay. 1 hour, Claire agreed. "That's all I can promise." She hung up the phone and stood there for a long time, staring at nothing, wondering what secret was important enough for her mother to break 11 years of silence. She had no idea that the truth waiting for her was far bigger and far more painful than a simple apology. Before Claire could think about tomorrow's meeting, her mind pulled her back once more to the year everything nearly fell apart. To understand what she was walking into, she needed to remember how far she had already come. 6 months after the wedding, the bakery job wasn't enough. Rent kept rising. Mark's hours at the repair shop were cut when the owner lost a major contract. They fell behind on bills for the first time in their marriage. Claire remembered the night she counted their savings on the kitchen table, every coin, every crumpled bill, and realized it wasn't enough to cover both rent and groceries that month. "We'll figure it out," Mark said, squeezing her hand. But his voice didn't sound as sure as his words. Claire lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. A part of her, a small and tired part, whispered that she could call home. She could apologize, even for something she didn't do wrong, and her family would take her back. The money would return. The comfort would return. But then she remembered her mother standing up in that church. She remembered Diane's cold voice calling her a mistake in front of everyone she knew. She would not go back. Not like this. Not begging. The next morning, Claire saw a job posting for an assistant position at a small consulting firm downtown. It paid a little more than the bakery, and it needed someone who could organize schedules, handle phone calls, and stay calm under pressure. Claire had no experience in the field, but she had spent her whole life watching her father run meetings and negotiate deals. She understood structure. She understood pressure. She applied. The interview did not go well. The room was full of much more qualified candidates, people with business degrees and polished resumes. Claire sat in the waiting area in her only good blazer. Feeling smaller by the minute, an older woman sat down beside her, sharp-eyed, wearing a simple gray suit that somehow commanded more respect than anyone else's expensive outfit. She glanced at Claire's nervous hands. "First interview like this?" The woman asked. "Is it that obvious?" Claire said, managing a small, tired smile. "A little." The woman studied her for a moment. "You look like someone who's had a hard year, but hasn't given up." "That's rare." Claire didn't know what to say. Before she could respond, her name was called for the interview. It went poorly. Claire stumbled over questions about spreadsheets and client management software she had never used. She left the building certain she wouldn't get the job. Walking quickly so no one would see the tears forming in her eyes, she didn't notice the same older woman watching her leave from across the lobby. 3 days later, Claire's phone rang with an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, expecting another rejection. "Is this Claire?" The voice asked. "This is Elena Alvarez. We met in the waiting room." Claire blinked, confused. "Yes, I remember. I own the consulting firm you interviewed at," Elena said. "You didn't get the assistant position, but I'd like to offer you something else, if you're interested." Claire gripped the phone tightly. "What kind of position?" "A junior research role. Lower pay to start, but real opportunity if you work hard." "I don't usually do this," Elena said, "but something about you reminded me of myself. A long time ago." Claire accepted before Elena even finished explaining the details. The job was difficult at first. Claire had to learn everything from nothing: financial reports, client presentations, negotiation strategy. She stayed late every night, reading books on business and finance that she borrowed from the library because she couldn't afford to buy them. Elena noticed her effort. Slowly, she began giving Claire more responsibility, more trust. One evening, while reviewing an old case file together, Elena mentioned something that caught Claire completely off guard. "This reminds me of a company I dealt with years ago," Elena said, tapping the papers. "Family business, textile trade, based near your hometown, actually. Bennett Trading, I believe it was called." Claire's whole body went still. Bennett Trading was her family's company. The one Diane now ran. The one her father had built from nothing. What? What happened with them? Claire asked carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. Elena frowned, thinking back. It was a strange deal. The numbers never quite added up. "I remember warning them about certain loans they were taking off the official books. I stepped away from working with them after that." Something wasn't right with their finances. Even back then, Claire's heart pounded. She said nothing about her connection to the company, but the word stayed with her long after Elena moved on to the next topic. Something wasn't right with their finances. Even back then, that night, Claire couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring out at the city lights, turning Elena's words over and over in her mind. She thought of her grandmother's proud face at the wedding, unwilling to accept anyone less than perfect for the family name. She thought of Diane, always so confident, so controlling, so quick to protect the family's reputation. What if Diane wasn't protecting the family that day in the church? What if she was protecting something else? Claire didn't have proof. She barely had a theory. But something inside her, some old instinct she hadn't trusted in years, told her that the wedding day disaster was never just about her choice of husband. There was something deeper, something hidden. Mark found her still sitting by the window near midnight. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside her. Claire shook her head slowly. "Elena mentioned something tonight about my family's business, about money problems no one ever talked about." Mark studied her face carefully. "What are you thinking?" Claire turned to him, a new fire behind her tired eyes. The same fire that had once made her walk down that all despite everyone telling her not to. "I'm thinking," she said quietly, "that one day, I'm going to find out exactly what happened. And when I do, they won't be able to hide from it anymore." Mark took her hand. He had learned over the past year never to doubt his wife when she spoke like this. "Then we'll find out together," he said. Claire looked back out at the city lights, a small, determined smile finally breaking through the exhaustion on her face. She had no way of knowing it yet, but that quiet promise, made in the dark of a small apartment, would take 11 years to fully come true. 11 years of learning, building, and becoming someone her family would never recognize, and somewhere far away without knowing it. Diane was already making the mistakes that would one day bring the whole family crashing down around her. Time moved differently once Claire made her quiet promise. The years didn't rush by, but they didn't drag either. Each one built on the last, brick by brick, until the frightened young woman who once stood alone at the altar was almost impossible to recognize. Claire worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. Under Elena's guidance, she learned how to read financial statements, how to spot warning signs in a company's books, how to negotiate without raising her voice. Elena became more than a boss. She became the mentor and eventually the friend that Claire desperately needed. "You have good instincts," Elena told her one afternoon, 2 years into the job. "You notice things other people miss. That's rare in this business." Claire smiled, but she never forgot the moment that had first shown her those instincts mattered. The moment Elena mentioned Bennett trading and the loans that never quite added up. She never asked Elena for more details. Not yet. She wasn't ready. She needed to become someone capable of handling the truth first. Whatever it turned out to be. By year 4, Claire had earned a promotion to senior analyst. By year 6, she was managing her own small team. Mark had also grown in his own way, eventually opening a small repair shop of his own, built slowly and honestly, one satisfied customer at a time. They bought a modest house. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who filled their home with a kind of happiness Claire had once feared she would never have again. But even with all this joy, there remained a small, quiet space in Claire's heart that never fully healed. A space shaped exactly like her mother's face, watching her from behind a pillar with fear instead of anger. By year 8, Claire had left Elena's firm to start her own small consulting company, focused on helping family-run businesses manage their finances honestly and transparently. The kind of businesses she wished her own family had been dotted. Was during this time that Claire finally allowed herself to look into Bennett trading properly. She did not do it out of anger. She told herself again and again that she only wanted to understand. Understanding felt safer than admitting what she truly wanted, the truth. And perhaps, deep down, a small measure of justice. Using public records, industry contacts, and careful, quiet research, Claire began piecing together a picture of her family's company over the past decade. What she found troubled her deeply. Bennett Trading had taken out multiple loans over the years, far more than a company of its size should have needed. Several suppliers had quietly stopped working with them, citing late payments. There were rumors, faint but persistent, of financial trouble beneath the company's polished, respectable surface. And at the center of every decision, every signature, every loan application, was Diane's name. One evening, while reviewing old public business filings, Claire found something that stopped her breath completely. It was a document from shortly after her father's death, over a decade ago, an inheritance distribution filing. According to the document, Claire had voluntarily signed away her share of the family inheritance shortly before her wedding, transferring her portion entirely to Diane. Claire had never signed any such document. She stared at the signature on the scanned filing, her hands trembling. It looked like her handwriting. It looked close enough to fool almost anyone. But Claire knew, with absolute certainty, that she had never held a pen to that page. It was forged. Her sister had not only humiliated her on her wedding day, Diane had used that same chaos, that same moment of family crisis, to steal Claire's rightful inheritance before Claire even had a chance to ask what happened to it. Claire sat in her office long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the document glowing on her screen. Anger rose in her chest, sharp and hot, but beneath the anger was something else, a strange, sad clarity. This explained everything. This explained the wedding day disaster. This explained why Diane had worked so hard to convince everyone, including their own mother, that Claire had abandoned the family. If Claire had stayed close to the family, she might have noticed the missing inheritance. She might have asked questions. Diane needed her gone, completely and permanently. And humiliating her at her own wedding was the perfect way to make sure Claire would never want to come back. Claire spent the following weeks gathering everything she could find. She reached out carefully to an old associate of her father's, a retired accountant named Mr. Whitfield, who had worked with Bennett Trading for over 20 years before quietly retiring shortly after her father's death. Mr. Whitfield agreed to meet her at a small cafe. Cautious and clearly uncomfortable discussing his old employer. "I always wondered why you disappeared so completely," he admitted, stirring his coffee slowly. "Your father would have hated to see the company end up this way." "What way?" Claire asked carefully. Mr. Whitfield hesitated, glancing around the quiet cafe before lowering his voice. "That, a lot of it. Your sister has been borrowing against the company for years, covering old loans with new ones. It's the kind of pattern that eventually collapses. Do you have proof of any of this?" Claire asked, her research instincts sharpening. "I kept copies of certain records," Mr. Whitfield admitted quietly. "Just in case. I always had a feeling something like this conversation might happen one day." He agreed to share what he had, on the condition that Claire would be careful, that she would use the information responsibly. Not simply out of revenge. Claire promised him she would. She meant it. Mostly, weeks turned into months as Claire carefully built a complete picture. The forged inheritance document, the hidden loans, the mounting debt threatening to collapse the company her father had spent his life building. She organized every file, every record, every signature comparison, with the same careful precision Elena had taught her years ago. She wasn't ready to act yet. She told herself she needed more proof, more certainty. But really, some quiet part of her was simply afraid of what would happen once the truth finally came out. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, exactly as she was closing the folder containing 11 years of careful research, her phone rang. Claire glanced at the screen. An unfamiliar number, but somehow she already knew. She answered, "Hello." There was a pause, and then a voice, older and shakier than she remembered, but still unmistakable, filled the silence. "Claire. It's Mom. I need your help, please." Claire's hand tightened around the folder in front of her, -1 years of hidden truth resting beneath her fingertips. Exactly at the moment her mother finally came looking for her. It felt less like a coincidence, and more like the universe had simply been waiting for both timelines to finally collide. Claire closed her eyes and steadied her voice. "Where do you want to meet?" The cafe was small and quiet, tucked away on a street Claire didn't recognize. She had chosen a table near the back, facing the door, the folder resting on her lap like a shield. She saw her mother before her mother saw her. Linda looked smaller than Claire remembered. Her once perfect posture had softened with age, and her hands trembled slightly as she scanned the cafe. When their eyes finally met, Linda froze in the doorway, as if she wasn't sure Claire would still be there. Claire raised a hand, just slightly. It was enough. Linda crossed the room slowly and sat down across from her daughter. 11 years of silence sitting between them like a wall neither of them knew how to climb. "You look. Linda's voice caught. "You look wonderful, Claire." "Thank you," Claire said evenly, giving nothing away. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. A waiter came and went, leaving 2 untouched cups of coffee cooling on the table. Finally, Linda broke the silence. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I didn't know who else to call." "Why now?" Claire asked again, the same question she had asked on the phone. 11 years, Mom, not one phone call, not one letter. Why now? Linda's eyes filled with tears. The company is failing. Claire. Bennett Trading. Your father's company. We're going to lose everything. Claire kept her expression carefully still, though inside. Everything she had discovered over the past several months settled into place like the final piece of a puzzle. What happened? Claire asked, though she already knew far more than her mother realized. Debt, Linda said, her voice breaking. So much debt. Diane says it happened because of bad market conditions, bad decisions years ago. She's been trying to fix it quietly, but the banks are calling in loans we can't repay. We might lose the building, the name, everything your father built. Claire studied her mother's face carefully. There was real fear there, real desperation. But there was also something else, a lifetime of choosing not to ask difficult questions, of trusting Diane's version of events without examining it too closely. And you thought of me, Claire said quietly. After 11 years of silence, I know it's not fair to ask, Linda said, hairs now falling freely. But you always understood numbers, business, things I never did. Diane said you might be able to help us find a way through this, if you are willing to even speak to us again. Claire's fingers tightened around the folder in her lap. Diane suggested you call me? Claire asked, her voice carefully neutral. Linda nodded, wiping her eyes. She said it was our last option. Claire almost laughed, though nothing about the situation was funny. Diane, who had spent 11 years making sure Claire stayed far away from the family and its secrets, was now the one suggesting Claire be brought back in. Once the truth was too heavy to hide alone anymore, Mom, Claire said slowly, I need to show you something. She opened the folder and placed the first document on the table between them, the inheritance filing from 11 years ago. Claire's forged signature clearly visible at the bottom. Linda stared at it, confused. What is this? This document says I gave up my share of Dad's inheritance, Claire said quietly. Voluntarily. Right before my wedding. I never signed this, Mom. That's not my signature. Someone forged it. Linda's face went pale. That's not possible. Diane handled all of that paperwork after your father passed. She said you didn't want anything to do with the business, that you had already decided to leave before the wedding even happened. I never said that, Claire said firmly. I never signed anything. And I certainly never stopped wanting to be part of this family. No matter how it may have looked that day, she placed a second document on the table, one of Mr. Whitfield's records showing a pattern of loans taken out against the company over the years, each one covering the last, building toward the collapse Linda now described. This has been happening for over a decade, Claire continued. Loans on top of loans. Money moved around to hide how bad things really were. Diane has known about this for years, Mom. She built an entire story to keep me away, so no one would look too closely at where the money was actually going. Linda's hands shook as she picked up the documents, reading them again and again as if the words might change if she looked hard enough. No, she whispered. No, Diane wouldn't. She loves this family. She's worked so hard to protect us. Has she protected us? Claire asked gently. Or has she protected herself? Before Linda could answer, the cafe door opened and Diane walked in. Diane froze the moment she saw them sitting together, folder open on the table, documents spread out like evidence in a courtroom. Her carefully composed expression cracked, just slightly before she smoothed it back into practiced calm. Mom, what is this? Diane asked, walking quickly toward their table. I thought you were meeting Claire to discuss the business. Not ... double quotes. Her eyes landed on the documents, and her voice trailed off. Sit down. Diane, Claire said calmly. Diane hesitated, then sat, her eyes darting between the papers and her mother's stricken face. I found the inheritance filing, Claire said, keeping her voice level despite the storm building inside her. The one with my forged signature. I also found Mr. Whitfield's records of every loan taken against the company since Dad died. Would you like to explain any of this, or should I? Diane's jaw tightened. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Someone had to keep this company running after Dad died. Mom was in no state to make decisions. I did what was necessary. Necessary? Claire repeated. It was necessary to forge my signature. Necessary to destroy the letter I wrote to Mom, begging just to stay connected to this family? Linda's head snapped up. What letter? Diane's face lost every trace of color. I wrote to you, Claire said, turning to her mother, about 6 months after the wedding. I told you I loved you, that I hoped we could find a way back to each other someday. I never heard back. Linda turned slowly to face Diane, her voice barely above a whisper. Is this true? Diane opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her carefully built world, constructed on 11 years of lies, hidden debt, and a stolen inheritance, was collapsing in real time. Right there in a small cafe that suddenly felt far too quiet, Diane, Linda said again. Louder this time, her voice trembling with a mixture of heartbreak and rising anger. Is this true? Diane's silence stretched on, longer and heavier with every passing second, and in that silence, Linda finally understood exactly how much she had lost and exactly who had taken it from her. Diane's silence lasted long enough for the truth to settle over the small cafe table like a heavy fog. Finally, she found her voice, though it came out sharp and defensive instead of apologetic. I did what I had to do, Diane said, straightening her shoulders. Someone had to make the hard choices after Dad died. You were grieving, Mom. Claire was leaving anyway. I simply made sure the company stayed in stable hands. Stable hands. Linda's voice cracked with disbelief. You forged your sister's signature. You stole her inheritance. You destroyed a letter she wrote to me, begging to stay part of this family. And now you've buried us in debt so deep we might lose everything your father built. I was protecting us. Diane snapped, her composure finally breaking completely. I was protecting this family's name, this family's future. Someone had to be strong enough to make the hard decisions while everyone else fell apart. You weren't protecting us, Claire said quietly, cutting through Diane's rising voice. You were protecting your own control. My inheritance would have given me an equal voice in this company. Instead, you made sure I disappeared completely, so no one would ever question your decisions. Diane's eyes flashed with anger. But underneath the anger, Claire could see something else now, fear. The same fear she remembered on her mother's face all those years ago at the wedding. Except this time, it was fear of being caught, not fear of losing a daughter. You have no idea what it was like, Diane said, her voice shaking. Running this company alone, carrying all that pressure while everyone assumed I was simply cold and controlling. You didn't have to carry it alone, Linda said softly. You chose to. And you chose to lie to me for 11 years instead. The cafe had gone quiet around them, though no one else seemed to notice the small family drama unfolding in the back corner. Claire took a slow breath, steadying herself for what came next. I'm willing to help save the company, Claire said. For Dad's sake, and honestly, for yours too, Mom, but only under certain conditions. Diane's head snapped up. Conditions? My inheritance is restored in full, with proper legal documentation this time, Claire said calmly. The company's ownership is restructured fairly, reflecting what Dad actually intended before he passed. And Diane steps down from her leadership position, effective immediately, with a full and honest account given to every family member, including Grandma, about exactly what happened to the company's finances over the past 11 years. You can't be serious, Diane said, standing up sharply. I built this company back up from nothing after Dad died. You want to just walk in and take it all away. I'm not taking anything that wasn't already mine, Claire said steadily. You took it first, Diane. I'm simply asking for it back. Along with the truth this family deserves, Linda reached out and gently placed her hand over Claire's on the table. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes after 11 years of silence. She's right. Diane, Linda said quietly. It's time to stop hiding. 2 weeks later, the entire family gathered at the old family home for the first time in over a decade. Claire's grandmother, now well into her 80s but still sharp-eyed and formidable, sat at the head of the table, listening as Claire calmly laid out everything she had discovered. The forged signature, the hidden loans, the destroyed letter. Diane's years of careful lies, built to protect a growing pile of debt she had never known how to properly manage. Diane sat silently through most of it, her earlier defiance finally replaced by quiet shame. When Claire finished speaking, the room fell into a long, heavy silence. Finally, the grandmother spoke, her voice steady despite her age. "I always suspected something wasn't right," she said slowly. "Your grandfather taught me to trust numbers more than words, and Diane's numbers never quite made sense to me, even years ago." She turned to Claire. "I made a decision some years back that I never told anyone about. I want to share it with you all now." She explained that, uncertain about the future of the company and suspicious of Diane's growing secrecy. She had quietly restructured her personal fortune years earlier, placing it in a trust meant for whichever grandchild eventually proved themselves honest, capable, and strong enough to protect the family's true legacy. "That grandchild is clearly you, Claire," she said simply. Diane said nothing. There was nothing left for her to say. In the months that followed, Claire worked closely with legal advisors and Mr. Whitfield to properly restructure Bennett Trading. Diane stepped down from her position, as promised, and though the family chose not to pursue legal action against her, given the pain it would cause their aging grandmother, Diane's role in the company and in the family's trust was never the same again. Claire took over as majority stakeholder, bringing the same honesty and careful precision she had learned from Elena Alvarez years earlier. Slowly, steadily, Bennett Trading began to recover, this time built on transparency instead of hidden debt. Linda visited Claire often in the months that followed. Awkward at first, and sure how to rebuild a relationship broken for over a decade. But slowly, carefully, they found their way back to each other. Linda apologized many times, not perfectly, but sincerely, and Claire, though she never forgot that day in the church, found that forgiveness, real forgiveness, was possible without forgetting what had happened. Mark stood beside Claire through every step, just as he had stood beside her on their wedding day, when the church emptied out and only he remained. A year later, Claire and Mark renewed their vows in the very same church where they had married 11 years earlier. This time, the church was full again, but for entirely different reasons. Linda sat in the front row, this time with tears of joy instead of fear on her face. Their children, now old enough to understand a little of their parents' story, stood proudly beside them. Even the grandmother attended, sitting tall and proud, watching the granddaughter who had finally proven herself exactly the way she always hoped someone in the family would. Diane did not attend. She sent a short, quiet note instead, an apology that felt more honest than anything she had said in the cafe weeks earlier. Claire read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. Not forgotten, not fully forgiven, but no longer something that controlled her. As Claire stood at the altar once again, this time surrounded by a family that finally saw her clearly, she thought back to the frightened young bride who once stood alone in this very spot, abandoned by everyone she thought she could trust. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and finally, completely at peace. Mark took her hand, just as he had 11 years earlier. "Ready?" he asked, smiling. Claire smiled back, steady and sure. "I've never been more ready in my life." And this time, when they said their vows, no one walked away.